Thanks everyone for that. We actually have one more session before we break for lunch. So we're going to be discussing navigating the geopolitics of technology and its impact on the Asian theater. And I'd like to welcome Claude to the stage.
Thank you. Yeah. Where's the, okay. Is it being loaded? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Last session before lunch, I'll try to make it as interesting as possible and as quick as possible as well, because I know we started late this morning and we've been having quite a bit that we started with. Let me start with this. 3 topics have entered the lexicon of every conversation, every conference, every meeting that we're having in the last perhaps couple of years, and it intensifying as well. So I'm sure every one of you will guess which 3 I'm talking about, but here they are anyway. So the first one is AI and its derivatives. We just had a panel on AI dedicated for that. Thanks to GenAI, GPT, OpenAI, GPU, all the Gs, NVIDIA, thank you very much, neural networks studying it all. Second topic is sustainability. We heard panels also on sustainability. Every conference dedicated to digital infrastructure talks about AI, talks about sustainability. The third one is geopolitics, specifically the US-China tech decoupling. I'm not a risk analyst. Actel Consulting is not a risk consultancy. We're a technology consultancy. So I'm going to take this topic from a technology angle. And for sure, I'm going to leave some things out. So please do bring that out to me later on. This is my first time I'm doing this. And very good, Joao, for having the idea to do this, because as far as I know, it's the first time we have a geopolitics session dedicated into a conference. So let me start with some of the decoupled domains. First one, the obvious one, is telecoms. Hello, Huawei. Everybody knows what's happening, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Second one is the space internet that I chose to discuss with you today. Third one is quantum technology. We had just a panel now, just her son mentioning that a bit. AI platforms, obviously. Subsea cables. I've written extensively about this topic, so I'm happy to share with you a little bit what I've come up with. And the last one is semiconductor, which is the hottest topic at the moment, right, given the latest restrictions that the Biden administration has imposed on China. So let me take these ones. This one is very easy. It's actually in 2020, Pompeo was Secretary of State for Trump, and very proudly declared by the end of 2020 that there were 180 telcos in the world that were supposedly clean. For them, clean meaning no Chinese vendor in those networks. So, so this is just a sample of those companies. So Huawei is out of these. So definitely that's round 1 for Huawei, and clearly a big loss for Huawei. But stay tuned here, because by the end of my presentation, you'll hear what happens in round 2. Specifically for Huawei, and perhaps moving out of Asia-Pac, they got kicked out of, at least from a 5G perspective, from key accounts that enabled them into their Western expansion. I'm talking about BT, which was the first foreign Western country to use Huawei, or TELUS in Canada, which was the first one in North America. So not to mention in this part of the world here, Singapore, Australia, Japan, India, all of these countries are no longer using Huawei in their 5G. Second topic is space internet. You all know about Project Kuiper by Amazon. Starlink, of course, is the biggest one. Many others as well. Many evolved from GEO to LEO, so you have some players that were in GEO and LEO. You have companies also, you have the merger of Eutelsat and OneWeb, yes, which has an India angle as well in it. Telesat, from Canada. And then the Chinese ones have not deployed at scale yet. They're not commercial yet, but they're accelerating their deployment, so watch that space. Quantum technology, 3 topics, I will break that down: quantum compute, quantum security, and quantum communication. So quantum communication, As you all know, there is much less signal degradation of the quantum information in space rather than in fiber optics. So that's why this topic is still, with China taking an early lead, is still in early days, and it's still getting developed. Europe is also working on it. Quantum compute, IBM is a big player, as you know. So are the Microsofts and Googles and some other startups like D-Wave and so forth. China, the development is very much driven by the state sector as opposed to private enterprises. But definitely US, China, two of the biggest players in quantum computing, with Europe and Japan and Canada as well, very actively in this space. Third one is quantum security. This is probably, from a geopolitics point of view, the hottest flashpoint because it affects cybersecurity. And here you have countries like China, US, Japan, Korea, very active in that space. Third, the fourth topic here is AI platforms. So we've taken a view here starting from the chips players, moving out to AI compute clouds to AI application players. So chips players, obviously, everybody recognizes the name NVIDIA, but there are many others as well, and some of them startups like Cerebras, like Sambanova, like Graphcore, in addition to some more established names that you see. And then you have some AI compute clouds, so you have the usual players, but you have also some companies like Crusoe, like Lambda, like CoreWeave, very, very active in this space. And I have not mentioned the Chinese yet, but you recognize the names as well over here. And finally, with the application players, everybody knows about OpenAI, but there are many others as well, Meta, Microsoft, etc. And you see some of the Chinese players as well over here, as well as, for those who read Chinese, there is a company called Qipu, which is perhaps one of the leading LLMs from China. So one thing I wanted to highlight here is just the role of these big American players that cut across. And likewise, if you're sharp eyes, you will have noticed that you have the same three players as well from China, very, very active here. And these are Huawei, Alibaba, and Baidu. So, these companies, you can see that to be successful in this field, you need a lot of data, which these companies do. You need strength, resources, heft, which counts a lot. Let's move to subsea cables. This is a very, very interesting sector here, really getting decoupled. It's incredible. Let me show you the cables here. They go by different colors. PLCN, so these are US-centric cable. The next slide will show China-centric cables. There was no such thing before, and there are still some cables that you cannot say are they US-centric or China-centric from before the latest geopolitics concerns, but they're getting more and more decoupled, and that's what I want to try to illustrate to you. So you see PLCN cable. You see at the very end, this is the cable going from the US to Taiwan and the Philippines, and they're supposed to go to Hong Kong as well now, no longer, right? So this cable is Google and Meta, and the original Hong Kong founder of this cable had to divest the 4 fiber pairs that they had because the cable goes to the US, and US was not allowing it to go ahead because it's terminating in Hong Kong, and because now Hong Kong is being seen as a Chinese city. Just going down here, some of the cables started after geopolitical tension. Apricot is very, very interesting. This is for the first time that you have a cable going from North Asia to South Asia, east of the Philippines. Every other cable used to go in the South China Sea, west of the Philippines. South China Sea, as you all know, you see the 9-dash line here that we're showing. China is claiming it of its own, and therefore, even though they're not saying, no, you can't, but there's all kinds of ways to delay or to make the cable impossible to go. Bifrost and Echo, as we all know, these are cables that started by Meta and Google, and for the first time, also cable connecting directly the US with Southeast Asia. Okay, usually cables used to go via Japan, via North Asia, go down the South China Sea to Southeast Asia. So this is good for Southeast Asia. CME-W6, that's the latest drama cable. The cable, going from Southeast Asia to Western Europe was to be awarded to HMN, the Chinese supplier, The decoupling happens also on the vendor side, right? So you see the vendors, Subcom is the US company, and you see Japan, as you know, Alcatel, France, and the last one is HMN, which you don't see on this cable because on the US-centric side. So that cable, anyway, US intervened and forced the use of Subcom, which is the US cable vendor. Let's go to the Chinese companies now. So you see, for example, HKA, which was a complete victim of the, connecting Hong Kong with America, complete victim of the geopolitics. That cable got canceled. CMIWI 5, you see this is the previous cable here, so same route as the new CMIWI 6. And then you see cables after geopolitical tensions, more and more being awarded from the China-centric pole to HMN, which is the Chinese vendor. Okay, let me move quickly to the next point here. Semiconductors, everybody following the news knows what's happening here. And when Huawei announced the latest Mate 60 phone, everybody kind of was surprised, oh, how could they do that? How could they have such advanced chips? So clearly, China is able to, with SMIC, of course, being the Chinese manufacturer, if you want the equivalent of Taiwan's TMSC, but in China, and Huawei more and more being using the role of, the likes of Intel and NVIDIA use in the US, which is a chip designer. So they came up with this very interesting technology. So the US players, the NVIDIAs, Intel, AMDs of the world, or European ARM, etc., are well known to all of you. I'm just highlighting some Chinese names over here as well. So not to be left around, the AI chips as well, China is making inroads in here. As you know, there were the first round of Biden administration sanctions happened a year ago, and then the likes of NVIDIA and others tried to find loopholes, but I'll talk about NVIDIA because they're a leader, obviously, in AI chips. But they found some loopholes and developed for the equivalent to the A100, H100, A800, H800, circumventing these sanctions to sell to China. But now the latest round of sanctions that just happened last month will forbid such sales as well. So we'll see what happens next with a question mark. These are some of the players from China. Implications. Flashpoint, South China Sea. Okay, South China Sea is the domain of China now, claiming it, of course being disputed by everybody around the South China Sea, including many countries in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Vietnam, etc. But it is a fact that, and subsea cables are being victims of that. Second flashpoint, not surprising, is the island of Taiwan, with the specter of blockade or worse, war or whatever it is, whatever it has onto that. That's not very good, conducive for Taiwan business development, be it digital infrastructure or whatever. Let me talk about some other points very quickly. So what's the effect, basically, of this geopolitical concern? Number one is you're seeing accelerated semiconductor plans in China. I just talked about Huawei, right? All of a sudden, they're accelerating. So, the way to look at it is that, this US is self-shooting it in the foot, basically, because through its actions, China is getting faster as a better and more worthy competitor to the US. Second point is accelerated LEO deployment in China as well. As I mentioned before, the US pole is way ahead. Starlink, for example, way ahead of everybody else. China has not launched at scale yet, but they're accelerating and they will very soon. Third one is divergence of standards. Remember when I said before, Huawei had got hobbled completely with 5G, but don't count them out. They will be back in 6G. So will 6G be a victim of this decoupling? Will we see again a divergence of standards in 6G, like Huawei using a different standard than Ericsson, Nokia? We don't know. The standards just converged with 4G and 5G. We didn't have convergence before. We had CDMA, we had GSM, etc. So will that fall a victim? Fragmenting of outsourcing, as you know, every US player is trying now, Apple, the biggest one, trying to diversify its hardware and software. India, for example, now building, trying to develop batteries for iPhones. You've heard the name of Vietnam and the name of semiconductor manufacturing. So moving away from China. It's going to take a long, long time, but there is an effort to go into that direction. Aggressive focus on new markets. Here in Southeast Asia, Japan, US, and China are three the biggest investors in this region over the years. So every given year you'll have one of these three that is the top. They change role depending on the year. But you'll see Africa in here. The same way that the Middle East was continues to be the oil source for the world and therefore carrying a very huge geopolitical importance. Today, Africa, what is it important for? Rare earth minerals. And China has been investing a lot in Africa. US is trying now to make up some of that and trying to also aggressively invest in that region. So we'll see what happens. And last one is reluctant AI legislation. So you heard the legal panel before, and they talked about legislation within Europe, legislation within the US, legislation within Canada, etc. Actually, it's lagging everywhere. Okay? And we just saw the battle at OpenAI, what happened with Sam Altman, right? So clearly, the pro-business camp and the less legislation, the less concern for ethics lost for now. But what I'm talking about here, from a geopolitical point of view, is US and China getting together towards common legislation. And we haven't seen legislation within the countries yet. We heard Sam from GDS saying that China did it the other way around, if you remember. And he's absolutely right. China addressed legislation within China before the explosion of AI. The US and other countries haven't done that. There was a meeting between the world's greatest powers about trying to get towards legislation, and they couldn't agree on anything. But the only thing they could agree on, Russia, China, and the US, and they hardly agree on anything lately, is not to legislate this sector. It's too important, including for military purposes. So just very quickly again here, bear with me. So I'm showing here Indonesia and Malaysia with a thumbs up. Because of, again, in the context of decoupling, in the context of geopolitics, we see that these countries are benefiting. Why? Because they're not lining up in one pole versus, like Australia, for example, is very much in the US pole. India is very much in the US pole, Japan. But Southeast Asia, and I'm using Indonesia and Malaysia specifically here, as you know, have welcomed investors, and you see data capacity and growth growing. So you see a number of foreign DC investors, and here we're highlighting also the number of the availability zones, both from Chinese pole and from the US pole. So the hyperscalers from the US and from China, both of them extremely present in these two countries. Singapore is another winner. First one is the subsea cables under construction. Singapore today, as we all know, the moratorium has been lifted, but that's been lifted in name, right? I mean, they've awarded 80 megawatt, but that's a drop compared to a single data center that's being built in Malaysia today or Indonesia. But Singapore will continue to be a hub, and is getting a bigger hub, a more important hub. Why? Because of the subsea cable. 26 plus, and every new cable, whether it's Chinese pole or US pole, as you noticed before, is still going via Singapore. So I'm calling this Magnet Island, because thanks to Singapore, it's expanding. Singapore doesn't have land, and especially doesn't have power, but Batam, Johor have come along. So Singapore again has emerged stronger, and they even use the data center moratorium, in my opinion, and I've written about this extremely wisely, by claiming now leadership in fighting climate change and being towards carbon zero drive. One way to look at it as well, the 4 awards that they've just given after the moratorium, you must have noticed 2 went for a US pole and the other 2 went to a Chinese pole. One more is Huawei here. Remember round 1, Huawei suffered a tremendous blow. 180 telcos are no longer using Huawei 5G. But look what Huawei did in the meantime. Mobile devices, Mate 60, I just told about. They just launched it, with 7 nanometer chips, and probably they're working on even 4 nanometer chips. We'll see. So this phone is extremely, was extremely welcome for Huawei to get back into the fore. So here they compete with the likes of Apple in China, for example, and elsewhere. Second one is cloud. I mean, everybody knows BAT, right? Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. I think that's being replaced by BAH now because it's Huawei. Huawei is the number 2 cloud player now behind Alibaba. Okay? So they were not in the top 3 not too long ago. So here they compete, for example, with the Alibabas of the world. Number 3 is chips. As I mentioned, the Kirin 9000 chipset into the Mate 60 phone, as well as the Ascend AI chipsets that they have. So here they compete in China again because they're no match to NVIDIA, obviously, but they compete. They fill the void, let's call it that way, that is left by NVIDIA and others because of the sanctions. Number 4 is telecoms. Again, here they will compete with the Nokias and Ericsson. And number 5, software in terms of AI application as well. So they have their own LLM as well, the same way that ChatGPT is and so forth. So and there's tremendous achievements by Huawei, in my opinion. Private equities as well have scooped in, so everybody knows this. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. This is just sample of example. I'm leaving many out. So you see Indosat Telstra gone to I-Square Capital. We had the president earlier speaking here, PCCW to Digital Bridge. Singtel, KKR investing into Singtel. EPLDT is looking for an investor at the moment. I'm sure others are as well. Globe as well into STT Telemedia. Hong Kong, on the other hand, not faring as well as the examples I've gave before in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore. US hyperscalers slow investing in Hong Kong, and on the other hand, Chinese hyperscalers are not very much investing either. I remember, I'm based in Hong Kong, I remember the Chinese hyperscaler were all setting up international headquarters in Hong Kong. The Chinese telcos, you know how important they are, China Telecom, China Unicom, China Mobile, all established international headquarters in Hong Kong and established the infrastructure to go with it, massive data centers and so forth. Today, as you know, with the geopolitics, Hong Kong is seen by the West and accused by the West to being a city, to being part of the China pole, and therefore we should make no distinction to Hong Kong. So not only the US hyperscalers no longer as active in Hong Kong, but you have the Chinese hyperscalers also, if they want to do business internationally, they prefer to do it out of Singapore instead of out of Hong Kong. Suspension, cancellation of key digital infrastructure projects like the HKA, PLC, and subsea cables that I mentioned earlier, and here they are. Telcos, yeah, I've been in the telco sector for more than 35 years now, so, right, Charles? You've been in the Singtel as well. Low market valuation, they've been frustrated by that. John, you know about this. CapEx requirements, for example, for building up 5G. Costlier kit due to fewer vendor choices, right? So it's either you go Ericsson, Nokia, or you go Huawei. You know, I mean, you don't have the competition as much between those two poles, so that's not good. And higher cost of capital, which very well documented because of interest rates. All of that means they're shedding assets. Singtel very openly, candidly stated not too long ago that they were frustrated by all of that. And lo and behold, you know, it took them a while, but KKR, you know, came in and jumped in at a much higher EBITDA, as we all know, than what Singtel trades at. So first type of assets they've been shedding, data centers. These are some examples. Second one, towers, and we've had the emergence of a sector called tower companies. I will not name them, you know, there are so many. And fiber networks. Just take some examples from Hong Kong. PCCW reportedly looking now for an investor. HEC made an unsolicited offer to merge with HKBN and so forth. So I call them asset-light telcos. That's where they're heading into. And last one is consolidation. So the first one is shedding assets. Second one is consolidating. Here in Indonesia, Indosat, as you know, consolidated with Hutchison. In Malaysia, Celcom with Digi. In Thailand, True with GTAC, sorry. Number 1 is CAT, C-A-T. So you have a duopoly in Thailand today. In Malaysia and Indonesia, you have 4 operators now, down from 5. I remember when Indonesia used to have more than 10 operators. Taiwan, you have also going down to 3 from 5. Philippines, you have 2. You have, Globe and PLDT. You have a third one, Dito, but struggling, which again, it makes the case that it's a lot easier to consolidate than to build a new one. And last one, but not least, is India, where you used to have like more than a dozen telcos, and really you have like really 2 big, very, very big telcos. And watch the space. In my opinion, I call India a winner-take-all market. So the same way you have Bharti and Jio on the telco side, I would not be surprised that we're going to see tremendous consolidation of data center space in India too, right? And you have some very, very big heavyweight in that space, so you cannot count them out. So, but some of the others, there's going to be consolidation, in my opinion. And that's it. Over for lunch. Thank you.